Welcome on into the Between the Hash Marks podcast. As always, Matt Lombardo from Between the Hash Marks and my good friend and mentor, the purveyor of Mike Tanier's Too Deep Zone, Mike Tanier. Mike, week one is in the books. What a wild and zany week one it was. And it felt a little bit more action-packed both on and off the field than maybe I remember in past years.
More action-packed on and off the field. I think having a Friday night game in there impacted the way we see things. So it's like another primetime showcase game that was easy to digest as opposed to like another Sunday 1 o'clock game that gets lost in the shuffle. And my takeaway from this, every week one, you get to jump to conclusions and you get the wacky results and you get these games where it's like, I couldn't have predicted that for the life of me. There wasn't a lot of I couldn't have predicted that for the life of me stuff happening. I mean, there were surprises, but for the most part, I guess except for the Bengals, there weren't any wild upsets. There wasn't any, oh my gosh, I can't believe this team looks that good or that bad. And even with the Bengals, you could look at them and say, oh, well, that's what they always do in week one,
For sure. And I'm not in a survivor pool this year, but I can only imagine the bloodbath in survivor pools with the New England Patriots going on the road to Cincinnati in Joe Burrow's return and Jamar Chase's potential, we found out, limited debut. And to have that happen, the Tanner Hudson fumble along the goal line, Mike Gesicki dropping the would-be touchdown pass in the back of the end zone, and the Patriots, the fighting Gerard Mayos, and going in and taking care of business with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, the upset of the weekend. But you're right. A lot of it had to do with the Friday night game being mixed in. And it was such a cool experience, at least in the Lombardo household, because the county fair was in town. We took the kids and we got the funnel cake and rode some rides. And they picked the rubber duck out of the pond to see what kind of prize they win in the game. And we come back and my 2-year-old son looks at me and goes, Daddy, let's watch the football game. And it was like, man, this is the beauty of parenthood, sitting back, watching a few minutes of that game with him before he goes to bed, and then settling in for a great weekend of football.
My sons are 22 and 18, and I have never heard any variation of, Dad, let's watch the football game in my life. Now, I don't mind. Obviously, we interact in a different way. We enjoy different things, but that's absolutely beautiful. That's sweet. And yeah, I mean, I got to go to the local sports pub and have some beers on a Friday night game, not on a deadline to write about it. That was exciting, especially here in Greater Philly. That was neat. Gotta admit, I fell asleep at halftime on the Monday nighter, as I so often do. But that was another one where there's a lot of takeaways, but
Yes.
not necessarily a lot of surprises based on what we saw last night.
Of course. And before we get into everything, a little bit of housekeeping for you. If you enjoy Mike Tanier's analysis, go ahead and subscribe to Mike Tanier's Too Deep Zone. If you enjoy the commentary and the insider nuggets, you can subscribe to Between the Hash Marks, my Substack. And of course, if you're just stumbling upon this podcast, subscribe to Between the Hash Marks with Matt Lombardo and Mike Tanier in Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. Even if you rip us in that review, leave us those 5 stars. Spotify, all your favorite podcast platforms, you can find us there.
Especially if you rip us in the 5-star review. We will talk about it. We will mention you on the air. We'll have a good time with it.
Of course. And, I had a lot of fun after the game last night. I threw out a post on Threads that after that loss by the New York Jets on the road in San Francisco, that there was not enough ayahuasca on this planet for Aaron Rodgers to survive that cross-country trip back to the confines of East Rutherford after getting their doors blown off by the somewhat shorthanded, but nevertheless as explosive and dangerous as ever, the San Francisco 49ers.
Yeah, and the Jets weren't really in this game. And they were in it the first quarter, but everybody's in every game the first quarter. I watch it, and one of the takeaways I say, okay, we could talk about Aaron Rodgers back and forth. He was fine mostly. He was fine. He was a little shaky at times. He was dominant for a couple of little stretches here and there. You reach a point in the third quarter of this game, or excuse me, in the fourth quarter, early in the fourth quarter, the Jets are down. Still a 2-score game. They get to 3rd and 1. They give the ball to Breece Hall, stuffed. 4th and 1, they go for it. Try to run a slant. I forget who the intended receiver is. He's not really open. There's no way Rodgers can thread him the ball. The game kind of ends there. They even take Rodgers out of the game at that point, which I guess I get. That's like the sinking feeling. You're down by 2 scores and you need 1 yard and you can't get the 1 yard under those circumstances. That's that crushing feeling where it's like, I don't care how good Aaron Rodgers may or may not be. This isn't good enough.
No, it's flawed. And, for everybody that I spoke to the last year and a half about Brees Hall, whether it's around the league or particularly inside that building, I can't tell you, Mike, how optimistic and excited the Jets are about Brees Hall. And two things jumped out at me. Number one, in that series that you talked about, if you're stuffed on 3rd and 1, if you believe that Brees Hall was your franchise running back, if you have any confidence whatsoever in what you've done over the past two off seasons to even build a somewhat competent offensive line,
Mhm.
run him on 4th and 1.
Right,
Go and get those yards, try it again,
right.
because throwing it in that spot with such a short field, with the secondary up on the line of scrimmage, it's just inviting trouble. It's not sending a lot of confidence to your young back. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds here with the New York Jets, but it just seems like for as much talent as there is on defense, and it's probably a top 5 or 6 defense based on talent at all 3 levels, for
Mhm.
all of Robert Saleh's abilities as a defensive play caller, it's hard for me not to look at what happened and feel that they're just as far away with Aaron Rodgers and that offense as it was called as they were a year ago without him.
I don't know. I think they're closer than they were without him last year. But yeah, I mean, last year the Jets defense, I think it was number one, number two in all categories. You have to make an assumption with defenses that there's going to be volatility. And unless you're talking about the 1985 Bears, and nobody looks like the 1985 Bears in the era of free agency, you're likely to go from one or two to number six, number seven. Your offense increases, your schedule gets more difficult, your expectations get higher. And you get stuck in this kind of nether region where I look at this team and it's like, I can find 10 wins. I can certainly find 8, 9, 10 wins. But this is where I've been for the entire offseason with this team.
Sure.
If 10 wins is your cap and you're paying Rodgers this much and he's only getting older, what do you do?
I'm not so sure that I see 10 wins. I thought that they were going to be a team with Aaron Rodgers back and healthy and, dropping Mike Williams, who was the invisible man last night, and credit the 49ers defense for that.
Right.
But, there wasn't a lot of balance. The offensive line looks like it's as patchwork as it was a year ago. It didn't look that great. And again, you're playing an all world
Yes.
defense. You're playing the best defense in football, maybe in the last several years. But I was not blown away by what I saw from Aaron Rodgers. 13 of 21, 167 yards and a touchdown. And you asked me before we went on the air, what are reasonable expectations for the Jets after
Yeah.
what you saw? You say you can find 8, 9, 10, maybe 11 wins for this team. I don't know. I think with the schedule, I think with Rodgers looking diminished, much more like 2022 Aaron Rodgers than 2021 MVP Aaron Rodgers, I get the sense that this could be a team that hovers around 500 based on their defense. And with everything that you have invested in a very short window with Rodgers, it just makes me wonder if they're 2 games under 500, 6 or 7 weeks into the year, what does that look like for the future of Robert Saleh? What does that look like for the direction of the Jets?
And nobody's job is safe except Aaron Rodgers and Nathaniel Hackett's. And I'm looking at those play calls, like those play calls and a few others. And there were times when the sequencing looked good and all. And I don't want to get deep into it, but like it doesn't matter what anyone thinks about Nathaniel Hackett. Aaron Rodgers likes this, and this is the football he wants to play. So if it's not optimized, then this is how it's going to be, and
Right.
everyone just has to live with it. The flip side of that is looking at the 49ers without Christian McCaffrey. I think Ayuk being in and out of the game a little bit.
Trent Williams going in for an IV at one point because he played every snap to that point without having any sort of preseason, which you touched on last time during the most recent episode of the podcast. You know, how long is it that you can go on without preseason and training camp mattering? It didn't matter in the outcome, but there were moments in that game where you saw maybe not being in the building
yeah,
impacted Ayuk a little bit, impacted Trent Williams a little bit as well.
in the first quarter. You could kind of
Yes.
see it in the first quarter. And I'm like, that whole thing tends to be a first quarter thing. The Eagles in the first quarter. Oh, let's trip over our own feet and fumble snaps and all these other things. I was watching the Seahawks first quarter and it was absolutely a poop show. So you do see some of that, but then everyone pulls themselves together. And yes, by the time it's like, oh gosh, Williams needs an IV and we might want to get Ayuk out of there for a while. You've already got this lead
Yeah.
because Jordan Mason is playing well. The blocking overall is playing well. And schematically, they're so good at everything that they're doing that you can just compensate with balance. You can compensate with balance between the run and the pass, between the yak and the yard and the air yards. Everything along the way is so set up that you can kind of like lose a piece or two along the way and still be a team with a very good defense and a team that had something to prove.
Yeah, and I look at last night. There's a very interesting dichotomy here because I think that losses like last night, the way that it went down for the Jets, I heard all year last year from people that if you're putting together a list of coaches on the hot seat, Robert Saleh is pretty high on that list, but he gets a pass because Aaron Rodgers was injured.
Yeah.
I think last night it heats up the seat a little bit more for Robert Saleh, but I go to the flip side of that coin and I look at Kyle Shanahan. And I had this thought today, looking back at what happened last night, diving into the box score a little bit. I almost wonder if we're somehow underrating Kyle Shanahan a little bit. I get it that he has to win a Super Bowl to secure his place from a legacy standpoint, but both of those Super Bowl losses came to Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. But you look at what they do. You look at the fact that it's essentially a turnkey offense for a quarterback, and Brock Purdy certainly is taking that to new heights.
Yeah.
But Christian McCaffrey, the engine that makes it go, he goes out, and you look at Jordan Mason going in, he rushes for 147 and a touchdown. Undrafted rookie running backs have rushed now for 40 rushing touchdowns for Kyle Shanahan in his career. They also have this elite defense in place. And I just wonder, are we underestimating and underrating what Kyle Shanahan is in the pantheon based on what they've built and how it's just an interchangeable parts and you don't skip a beat in San Francisco?
Like he winds up being some Marty Schottenheimer type character throughout history. And what happens is he is his own worst enemy in these absolute crucial one flip of the coin type situations late in the season. He steps on those rakes. But if you want somebody who's going to beat you by 21 week in and week out and get to that situation with the two-faced Harvey Dent coin flip, he's outstanding at that. And we can talk about Mason and we can talk about Purdy and we can do another, referendum on Purdy. Outstanding environments develop outstanding players. Okay. When you have this environment where everything clicks at this level, it creates a situation where a Brock Purdy can go from nowhere to being, let's say a top 12 quarterback. Okay. You can grow in this situation in a way that you can't in, let's say, Carolina.
Right.
I think we're going to talk about them later. You get here, you come here, and Mason, you've been hanging around practice squads or whatever. You come out. Yes, you're breaking tackles, you're making cuts and things like that. But you have all of these opportunities. Your yards before contact are extremely high. These plays are so schemed up. You've also been working in this for during the preseason, et cetera, et cetera. You're in this, so that's what you create. The 49ers bake these opportunities. Like, how do they keep hitting in the late rounds? They're not hitting in the late rounds. They have a system in place where the late round guys, when they get their opportunities, are ready to play. Andy Reid does something similar. He's got Mahomes at the top of the pyramid to help. But that's what the 49ers are doing. That's what makes Shanahan so special. That makes his team. And I say this here in Philly with my Eagles paraphernalia behind me, like, oh, God, this team, so hard to beat and so hard to pick as anything other than the favorites.
Well, who stops them? Because, we can talk all we want about what they've built. We can talk about the system. We can talk about the culture. We can talk about the philosophy. The results speak for themselves. I mean, you've got the 2 Super Bowl trips on Kyle Shanahan's resume. You got multiple trips to the NFC Championship game. And oh, by the way, you go into this year and you settle all family business 8 days before the regular season. Now everybody is happy except for maybe Deebo Samuel at some point, depending on
he's
his
never
year.
happy. He's never happy. You don't worry about making Deebo happy. Just make sure, get out there, go. He's probably ticked off all the running snaps he had.
Right, exactly. After fighting not to be classified as a running back a couple of years ago, but who stops this team, especially on that side of the bracket?
They stop themselves. I mean, you hope for a situation where you get to the fourth quarter and you don't drop the pass against them. Whether you're the Lions, et cetera, or you hope that they do something suboptimal in this at that lower level, tactical level, where Shanahan will kick a field goal when he shouldn't necessarily do it, or punt when he shouldn't do it, or assign the third string tight end to block the edge rusher, et cetera. Do one of these little mistakes, because if it's toe to toe, everybody at full strength, you're kind of just hoping for that non-repeatable thing. And by the way, when we talk about that team's luck, when field goals doink in,
right?
Okay, when Rodgers' worst pass, where really it's just like the defender gets in front of him, just swats it, and it just lands in the hand of a cornerback. It's not that they're not great but lucky; it's that they're great
and they create luck.
And they're lucky, and they create luck. Yes, and then they capitalize on it.
So I think that they're, and again, week one is overreaction week for a reason, and
Yeah.
there has been so much ink spilled and so many columns printed off the internet only to be put in the shredder later on in the year based on what happens in the opening week of the NFL season.
Uh,
But if there's one team that I think has a shot to stop the 49ers, it's the same team that I think has been on a collision course with them for the NFC Championship game in a rematch, the
yes.
Detroit Lions. Because what I saw on Sunday night is a team that built a big lead. For whatever, I think Dan Campbell, the pendulum swung to the complete opposite side, and he decided, I got this big lead. I'm not going to pedal down. We're
Yeah.
going to try to coast here. And then you realize, well, maybe it really isn't in their personality and
Oh,
their MO to coast. They have
oh,
to beat teams 80-0 or not at all. But then in the overtime and the fourth quarter, they just become this steamrolling juggernaut of a running offense. David Montgomery becomes a bowling ball, wins the game single-handedly on that last drive in overtime. And I look at San Francisco and I look at Detroit, and they're they're almost like fraternal twins, I think I would call them, because they're built so similarly with a similar MO. And it just seems like they're the class of the conference. And then there's everybody else.
I feel like Lions fans and Eagles fans came out of those games, the Friday night or Sunday nighter, with a
Yeah,
and like, oh, look at that mistake, look at that mistake. And then when you look at it and say, all we have to do is fine tune some of these things, and we should be humming in this situation. For the Lions, when they downshifted into mode in overtime, it felt like that's what they should have done late in the third quarter. What they were trying to do is let's remain sequential. Let's drop back passing and do our thing. And they were kind of playing into the Rams' hands of saying, "Oh, you're not just going to pound the ball down our throats. You're going to give our secondary a chance to do things. You're going to give us the ball back." And then it was almost like the statement there where we can kind of thump the ball at you. And that was like the Lions' personality that I wanted to see for that whole game. We saw a little of it in the first quarter from them as well. But they can do it. I think the Eagles can do a similar thing. You take away, we're not going to take away the Hurts interceptions because they're real.
for
Take
sure.
away the two effed up snaps and like Saquon tripping over his feet at the beginning of the game
In Brazil,
in Brazil
on a soccer pitch.
on a soccer pitch, on a muddy soccer pitch. Like it's like, and then you take away some of the, okay, there's a roughing penalty here or there. You minimize that. That's a very different game. And I think that's a somewhat easy win for the Eagles.
Yeah, and certainly, it's unfortunate what happened to Jordan Love, but I think you kind of have to wonder what the Packers are going to be if they have to turn to Malik Willis over the next three or so games, if he has to play at all. But I look at the Eagles and, Mike, we were kind of going back and forth on social during that game a little bit.
Uh,
That was what we expected to see from Saquon Barkley, and not just Saquon Barkley this year in an Eagles uniform, two rushing touchdowns, the focal point of the ground game. And oh, by the way, a wheel route concept for a touchdown that looked very similar to what I saw in 2016 in the Big Ten title game against Wisconsin, where Joe Moorhead drew up a wheel route and Trace McSorley hit him in stride for the score. But that's kind of what you always thought Saquon Barkley was going to be in New York. But instead, Pat Shurmur and Joe Judge, and to a lesser extent, after year one, Brian Dable, decided to use him as this battering ram up the middle 28 times a game when he's a space player and a weapon in space, and he's going to make guys miss and get you all kinds of yards after contact and after the catch. And if that's a glimpse with the three touchdowns and over 150 all-purpose yards from Barkley in the opener that the Eagles are going to get, look out for Philly, I guess.
yeah. I mean, it's value added. You can't be a space player when there's no space.
That's true.
Right. And that was the thing you were dealing with. You're looking at a Giants team that had nowhere else to go with the ball. So they put Barkley in a battering ram situation behind an offensive line with one great player and four, barroom bouncers. And this is what you get. You see that. You see how he can interface with the other weapons on the Eagles offense. And, Hurts has got to, not force some of these third down passes, et cetera. But you can see the growth potential of that Eagles team. And I think you can say the same thing on defense, where you can say, oh my goodness, Quinyon Mitchell was great. Zach Bond was great. There were some gash runs. There was some goofiness where guys looked like they didn't know where to line up. You want to see correctable things from these contenders in week one. What you don't want to see is, hey, there's a guy who doesn't even belong on the field, which I think you sometimes saw from a couple of teams this week one.
And you saw pretty frequently from the Eagles defense a year ago, especially down the stretch over that closing finish, going from 10-1 to losing on the road in Tampa Bay in the wild card game. You kind of took the words out of my mouth there, Mike, because I think the two things that jumped out at me beyond what the Eagles did on offense, because I thought they did enough on offense, and I think that we saw a glimpse of what they're going to be with Saquon Barkley as the engine that makes it drive, similar to Christian McCaffrey in San Francisco. But defensively, Zach Bond looked like a playmaker. Nakobe Dean looks like he's taken major strides. It looks like he's finally ready to be the player that we saw 3 years ago at the University of Georgia. That if you fix the linebacking core, which was a weakness, if you get the young players to grow immediately, like Quinyon Mitchell in the secondary, which you alluded to, and you have two competent coordinators,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you look at what Howie Roseman has done in free agency and through the draft over the next 2 years. If this coaching staff can operate at that level moving forward, the Eagles are kind of in that conversation.
Yeah, and they have 3 games coming up against the NFC South.
Right.
You could possibly see win. You don't do that, as a fan, you say you see 2-1 in the stretch, which gets you to 3-1. And you talk about the linebackers. Wouldn't it be great if when Devin White returns, his only role is okay, situational. We're gonna put you in a gap, get ball, go straight, get ball, go fast, get guy. Like no zones, no complexity in your brain. Go get quarterback or just go cover that one guy. That would be a great role for him, and they can do that if Baum and Dean are ready to take these next steps.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about the teams at the top of the NFC. And we haven't even touched on Kansas City that looks like, oh, by the way, the Chiefs are going to be the team to beat again when you add Xavier Worthy and all that speed. But I think we also some inconvenient and uncomfortable truths revealed themselves at the bottom of the league.
Are we switching? Are we going down to the bottom now?
I think we got to go into the elevator
Yes.
and the Tower of Terror ourselves down to beyond ground level here. The New York Giants, I think I wrote this in 4 Downs on Monday. Go check it out. They just seem perennially 3 years away from being 3 years away. And they're in year 3 of the Brian Dable, Joe Shane epoch experiment, whatever term you want to use. And they didn't look like they belonged on the field with Sam Darnold's Minnesota Vikings on Sunday at home.
That's it. If you come out and say, well, this is going to be a Giants loss, like, well, okay, this is still a work in progress team. It's not close.
No.
It's not close in any way. By late in the first quarter, it is no longer close. Okay, they can't stop 100-yard drives executed by Sam Darnold. They can't. And Daniel Jones looks worse.
There's a stat that's floating around. I don't know who had it first or who to credit it to, but whoever found it terrific, that since Daniel Jones signed that contract, the $40 million contract last offseason, and again, he was hurt and he only appeared in 6 games, but in 6 games, 7 including Sunday, as the starting quarterback of the New York Football Giants, he's thrown 2 touchdowns. Saquon Barkley, in his Philadelphia Eagles debut, had 3 touchdowns from scrimmage in 1 game. And we talk about everything that happened there and the commitment to Daniel Jones, letting Saquon Barkley walk out the door, the debate over whether or not running backs matter. Spoiler, the Giants were probably right not to re-sign Saquon given where they are.
Yeah.
Like even bigger question marks about committing to Daniel Jones.
Yeah.
And if this is what Daniel Jones is, and there's nothing that he's done as of yet in his career to show that he's anything other than what we're seeing right now, I don't know, Mike, how Joe Shane and Brian Dable survived to year 4 to go and draft the next quarterback.
I think Shane is going to be, if this continues, Shane's going to throw Dable under the bus. Dable's going to try to throw Shane under the bus. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be fun to watch from the outside if you don't have any like inside sources you're worried about. But it might be entertaining for non-Giants fans to look at. But it's 2 touchdowns by Daniel Jones and 3 pick sixes.
Yeah.
Although I looked at that 1 pick 6, and that's really a great play by Van Ginkel. That right tackle's got to like knock his ass down there. But I want to look at, I haven't gotten them yet. It's Tuesday morning here. The accuracy numbers, because like Daniel Jones, at least on like 5 to 10 yard passes in the past, these very easy throws tended to be accurate. They're sailing at guys' elbows and ankles and feet and like wide all over the place. I am not sure what he's doing. He looks like the basic things that he was able to accomplish last year before the injury, 2 years ago during his good season. He's not even accomplishing them right now. And I don't want to get into a Sam Darnold thing because there's a lot of like weird pro Sam Darnold stuff out there right now. I think that's just Vikings copium, but whatever. Sam Darnold's a better quarterback than Daniel Jones.
I agree. And let's be crystal clear here that my biggest concern and my biggest issue and biggest criticism with Joe Shane isn't that they committed to Daniel Jones, because
Okay.
I can get it. You're coming off of the playoff run. If you don't have it, you're in no man's land in the draft in terms of who's your next quarterback going to be. So I can understand Daniel Jones.
Yeah. Okay.
What I
Yeah.
can't understand is I can't name you one of the Giants starting cornerbacks at a premium position
Yeah.
3 years into a rebuild.
Yeah.
I can't, I look at that offensive line, and even though they invested resources into it, and that was the goal, they're no better along the offensive line today than they were than when Joe Shane arrived. When
Yeah.
you look at the weapons on offense, it's great that they have Malik Neighbors with a lot of upside. I think Jalen Hyatt could be a player. Wan'Dale Robinson has flashed, but the weapons are still pretty limited at the NFL level. You can compete in the ACC with that receiving core. I don't know that you can create separation in the NFC East. The pass rush is fine.
Oh yeah, that's
Lawrence is an all pro, but you didn't draft Dexter Lawrence. The
yeah.
linebacking core is kind of a hodgepodge
The
of waiver wire pickups.
Oka. Why can't I not say this linebacker's name? It rhymes with help me. Who's the linebacker? Oka
Yeah, no, I know you're
carrot
talking
cake.
about.
Carrot
Yes,
cake.
a Carricane. Yes,
Yes, carrot
Carricane.
cake. He's
Yes.
good. He's really good. I don't want to call him carrot cake, but he's really good. Oh, carrot cake.
Okay, so you have five players. You have five players on a 53-man roster 3 years into being the general manager. Mike, that just can't happen. And you know, this is an organization where John Mara, there was a stretch where they fired 3 head coaches in 5 years.
Yeah. I'm sorry I broke myself with carrot cake there, so I'm trying to regroup here. But you're right. Now remember, the offensive line, huge miss, Evan Neal.
Huge.
Catastrophic miss with Evan Neal. That's a problem. You talk about your playmaking core, the Waller situation. Okay, now this is an individual who decided to kind of leave the NFL. You have to anticipate that to a degree. When you spend a lot of money to bring Waller in at tight end, somebody who had a lot of lingering injuries and things like that, was already in his 30s, and you commit to him for several years when you're like an 9-18, whatever they were, 9-7-1, you have to anticipate that there's a high risk there. So they've got nothing at tight end right now.
Right.
So there's a miss. You mentioned the secondary. Okay, I think Deonte Banks might be okay at cornerback. You lose McKinney to free agency. Why'd you lose McKinney to free agency? Because you're in cap situation. Why are you in a cap situation?
You committed to Daniel Jones.
Because you committed to Daniel Jones and some of these other guys along the way. It's a bad setup. So now you go back to the Maras, and that's what you were saying at the end. These guys have been firing coaches. They've been like moving on from general managers. They're reluctant to do it again, but we're already barreling down that road.
I also don't know how reluctant John Mara is when I watch him on Max, and he says point blank to Joe Shane that if Saquon Barkley winds up in Philadelphia, I don't know how I'm going to sleep at night. And here we are, Saquon Barkley with 3 touchdowns from scrimmage in his Philadelphia Eagles debut. So I just look at this situation. If you had to ask me today on September 10th, after the first week of the season, which head coach is on the hottest seat, which head coach is earmarked to be fired first, it has to be Brian Daboll. And I don't know that Brian Daboll bears the brunt of this, because I think that Joe Shane is just as, if not more, culpable for the New York Giants mess as Brian Daboll is at any point here.
I think Shane deserves a lot of the blame here, but you do have Daboll calling plays right now. I thought Kafka was a heck of a play caller. I don't know what the logic is behind that situation. You had the whole Wink Martindale situation last year.
Coaching staff blew up.
Yeah, you hear all these things that kind of come out of the things there, and like it's a little Joe Judge like behind the scenes. So, but I'll leave with one thought. When you are trying to run the New York Giants, there are 2 big mistakes you can make. One is doing what Mara says, and the other is not doing what Mara says. Because if you do what Mara says, it's probably stupid and it's going to get you fired. But if you don't do what Mara says, he's the boss, which means you're going to get fired.
Correct. And there's a situation that might be a worse roster, but I don't think that either Dan Morgan nor Dave Canales are in any real danger of being fired. Bryce Young, on the other hand, the Carolina Panthers might find themselves in the dubious position of being the first franchise since 1946 to have drafted a quarterback with the #1 overall pick 2 times in 3 years, because we can criticize Daniel Jones, and he merits a lot of criticism with this being his 6th NFL season, but I just don't see it in Bryce Young. I don't see any growth. I don't see any development. I don't see any improvement. You kind of can, overlook some of his issues because it's the worst offensive line in football by leaps and bounds. But that was bad. There's no excusing what that was on Sunday in New Orleans, Mike.
By the way, I load up between the hash marks. After I'm done writing my thing and publishing mine, I load yours up. And there's this guy named Dankowitz.
Yes.
Dankowitz, who sounds like Cheech and Chong's accountant or something like that. Dankowitz. Now, this was the kid that got drafted as a quarterback out of Notre Dame. Help me out with Dankowitz, because this was in your thing.
Yeah, the Boston Yanks in 1944 selected Heisman Trophy winning Angelo Bertelli, but there's a problem here. Bertelli was an active service member in the Marine Corps, so he never played it down for the Boston Yanks, even though they invested the number 1 pick in him. So they round back 2 years later, still looking for a quarterback, and the Boston Yanks round back with Frank Dankowitz from Notre Dame, who is he has the distinction of being the only quarterback as the second quarterback chosen in 3 years with the number 1 overall pick by a franchise in league history.
I'm confused by Dankowitz at Notre Dame. There seems to be a religious confusion here that's bothering me, but I'm gonna set that one aside for a second. But we have to go back to the Boston Yanks, which is a bad sign because that's not a team anymore. And I've never heard of either of these quarterbacks. So that's a bad sign. Let's get back to Young. Okay. He doesn't, he looks like he doesn't belong on an NFL field. I'm talking on the DVOA Discord with a lot of the old Football Outsiders guys, and they're doing what we should all do when we're analyzing quarterbacks. Like, well, we're in wait and see. We need to gather more information. I'm not sure what more information I need to gather on a 5'9", 185 pounds, soaking wet guy who isn't particularly fast when he's running. He would be in the B, C plus tier of scramblers if he had to move. Doesn't seem to be able to locate receivers downfield. Has no concept whatsoever of how to pick up a blitz. And I think that might be on Canales to a degree. I have a hard time looking at Young and saying this is the NFL attribute that we're supposed to be waiting to develop.
It's bad enough that they chose him number 1 overall in the draft.
Mm-hmm.
It's worse that they chose him number 1 overall in the draft over CJ Stroud, after Stroud goes on to be immediately a top 10, maybe top 5 quarterback in the league and leads the Texans to the playoffs a year ago. But I spoke to an NFL executive on Sunday afternoon who was doing some scouting at the Superdome, who saw this game. And he told me, quote, "I'm really not trying to pile on the kid here.
Yeah.
But that game gives me the same read and same feel on Bryce when he came out in the draft. It's hard to exist in the NFL, in an NFL pocket at that size. It's never been done before. Never," unquote. So the size is the big concern. But I think what's worse here, Mike, he seems to be swimming. And there are some pieces. There are some weapons. There are some weapons there at receiver. And, you have Jonathan Brooks soon to come back. You have Miles Sanders, who's a serviceable running back. Adam Thielen's a veteran. But none of it matters because the offensive line is you, me, my father, and the kid who plays JV ball down the street.
Well, and part of that is, okay, very early in the game, I think it was his first throw. You go back and watch his first throw. The pocket is kind of holding, but it is kind of pushing back on him. But this is a clean pocket for 31 NFL quarterbacks. And when you see his ball, it looks like it's like being thrown over a fence by like your son. Like, he is so small, and once these guys have come back on him, he's kind of launching the ball at this trajectory that's like, maybe I can get it over there. I'm not sure what he's seeing. I believe he floats it over his receivers and right to a defender for an interception. And the game kind of unfolds like that. And all that what we saw last year unfolded like that. And that's the size issue. Let me ask you this about your source, or just back it up for a second. You and I were hearing the same things before the draft.
Yes.
How over positive was it for you? Because all I heard was this positivity Don't worry about the size because of the makeup of this young man's character and his athleticism. Did you hear that? How much of that did you hear?
Coming from Alabama, one with Nick Saban, played in a lot of big games. The
Yeah.
big game experience is going to override it. Those
Since
were sort of things that
since
I heard
high
about.
school, since high school, he was groomed for this, and he was in these academies, and we got to know the young individuals. And man, it was I don't know what to say, but I had him first overall on my board because it's like, well, if these many people are vouching for him, I guess he's Russell Wilson.
Outside of one coach who has been kind of down on him through the whole process, who pretty quickly, vented to me, oh, how the heck could Frank Reich have been so wrong? I don't know what Frank Reich saw in him, blah, 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 blah. Outside of that one coach, you're right. It was a lot of this kid is going to be the franchise and you can build around him and he has the temperament and he has the acumen and everything that you look for in a quarterback. But if you can't see over the offensive line, and if you look at what is happening in terms of just how overmatched he is, the first throw of the game you talked about, it was to nobody in particular, and it was intercepted.
Right.
And then this is a turn the page. You hate to put this on a kid in his second NFL season, but let's be real here. It's an audition with a new head coach who's supposedly a quarterback guru and whisperer, a
That
new
was right.
general manager who was in the building as the assistant GM, but we have no real idea how Dan Morgan felt about Bryce Young versus CJ Stroud and whether he was overruled by David Tepper and Frank Reich or Scott Fitterer or what those conversations were. But if you're Dan Morgan and you're Dave Canales, if it doesn't get better and you're picking one or two in the draft, and I don't know how you're not based on what we've seen from the Giants and from the Panthers, I don't know how you're sitting in that position and you don't turn the page and you don't draft a quarterback. It just feels like this is bad all around for Carolina. It's even worse all around for Bryce Young.
Yeah.
And Mike, I don't know if he can do enough to preserve his job from here on out with what they have in front of him along that offensive line.
No, I don't think so. And you talked about the other pieces, and the other pieces are kind of sort of okay, not like not what Caleb Williams is working with on a day-to-day basis. By the way, I didn't think it was Reich that picked him. I did not think it was Reich. I thought one of the reasons Reich isn't there no more is because it was a Fitterer / Tepper decision.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I could see Reich preferring Stroud. I could see him preferring Anthony Richardson. And again, when you look at Anthony Richardson, he makes these mistakes, and you're like, well, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. And then you watch him for 5 more minutes, like, oh, that's the NFL thing. Oh, that 60-yard pass on a rail or trucking two defenders. You can see these attributes.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think we're both down on Young is where are the attributes?
Right. What's the redeeming trait? What is the skill set that's going to, lead him out of this? The mobility is fine. The arm strength is okay. But he doesn't process information quickly. The accuracy is not what you want out of a number 1 overall pick. And all of a sudden, this is also playing out against the backdrop, the very real backdrop that CJ Stroud might go to a Super Bowl this year. And you passed on him.
Absolutely. And if Young's best attribute is, well, he's high character and high IQ and everything like that, I wish him a 45-year career as an offensive coordinator,
right.
Root for you in these other places. But I don't think it's happening as an NFL quarterback.
I don't know about you, but I'm sitting here on Sunday and I was just waiting for a big game to captivate me. There was nothing all that captivating that happened Sunday. And I'm sitting there writing 4 downs. I don't know if you felt this way about watching the games, trying to put together the walkthrough, but nothing really grabbed my attention. Whereas the primetime games, that was one of how amazing was it to watch Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson go, pardon the expression here, toe to toe. Isaiah Likely with the toenail stepping out of bounds at the back of the end zone.
Dad jokes. You're too young for dad jokes, Matt.
Not according to the 5-star review from a week ago. But then you look at Friday night with the Packers and Eagles and the high drama there, and who's gonna get it under control and make the fewer mistakes first, and who's gonna take that over. Captivating. Aaron Rodgers last night, the 49ers greatness, captivating. I didn't get that feel on Sunday, but I think we're going to get it on Thursday night when you look at the Bills and the Dolphins. What a great game this has the potential to be.
Great game. 2 teams that are fighting right now, possibly for that division title. 2 teams that had scares in week one. I think one reason we weren't on the edge of our seats week one is because most of us were not watching the Buffalo Cardinals game, in which the Cardinals took this big lead, and then Josh Allen had to put on the Superman cape and do the things he did and kind of deliver that statement with a lot of help from his defense getting their act together, etc. I did watch, and you talk about not being on the edge of your seats. I was enjoying the Steelers Falcons in this like weird, ironic way because it was
Yes.
so weirdly yucky. The Jaguars Dolphins game, except for the fact that you see Tyreek Hill come in after that, what did they call it? That whirlwind situation before the game. That's what we're going to call it euphemistically here, and go ham. That was a rough game, and the Dolphins looked kind of hit or miss, kind of wobbly. Way too many sideways throws, way too many fourth down mistakes. Needed a big mistake by the Jaguars to get in that game. And now they have to host this Buffalo Bills team that did have some question on its own, but I think we're going to see who's got like the fortitude to be the team that stays there in that division.
And along those lines, I spoke to OJ McDuffie for 4 Downs, Dolphins legend OJ McDuffie, and just to get his thoughts on that game in general and how it played out. And he said a lot of the same things that you did, as far as it took them a little bit of time in that game to get their act together, to get on the same page. But the Tyreek Hill situation, quote, galvanized them. What happened before the game, and all of a sudden you see Tyreek sees Jonnu Smith and Calais Campbell come and try to intervene to help him out, that can bring a team together. And then you go and you bust out for 130 yards, including an 80-yard touchdown catch and run, that can be a launch pad. And what have we talked about all offseason about the Miami Dolphins, Mike? You hate to equate what happened to Tyreek Hill off the field, because it was quite honestly frightening to watch happen, to anything on the field. But if that's the moment that galvanizes and brings a team together that just previously thought that they could roll the ball out and run past you and sprint past you like a track team, but now they can overcome adversity, they can beat a playoff caliber defense, they can come through in clutch moments. Maybe that is a moment that you look back on in January and February and say, hey, that really elevated them as a team, as a group. That week one win, not only what happened off the field, but having to come back in the second half against a really good Jaguars team.
And I don't want to go deep into the weeds on the Tyreek Hill situation, but like the person who handled himself with a lot of grace and dignity and was forthright, but was also sort of de-escalating things, was Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
The guy who isn't always like that, let's be clear,
Right.
is not always like that. He has been handling this unbelievably well and letting that swirl around him. And I think that speaks volumes for who he is right now as a person. And again, teammates like Calais Campbell, who were involved in that situation. And they did pull together. And again, like in the late game, they needed like sort of a pounded out drive at the end of that game. And they were having trouble with the new defensive line of the Jaguars that now has Eric Armstead in there with Josh Hines Allen and Trayvon Walker. They sort of pulled it together there. This is now, if they can pull it off twice, and they can get the bad weather version of the Bills, because down in Miami we'll call heat bad weather. If they can get that, then I'm going to be more of a believer in them. Right now, I'm looking forward to this game because it's a Thursday night game that doesn't suck,
right?
Which is amazing. But I'm looking at that game and I'm leaning, this is probably the Bills. They also, again, they started out very flat in that game and then kind of started steamrolling. I want to see if they can keep that steamroller going.
I want to see if Josh Allen can take over the game against that defense down there in Miami. It's one thing to come back and do some magical things in the second half against the Arizona Cardinals. And by the way, Kyler Murray misses Marvin Harrison Jr., who's so wide open you can't even see a Bills defender in the frame. But I want to see Josh Allen take that game over. And I think that there's something to be said for coming down to Miami when it's going to be 92 degrees and 96% humidity.
Yeah.
It just that's a unique challenge. It's different doing that in September versus doing it in December. But this is a playoff preview, as you alluded to. It's two of the best teams in the division, potentially the top two teams fighting for the AFC East title. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I can't wait.
Was that an official weather report?
That was me pulling numbers out of what I would expect Miami to feel like.
I'm pulling one right now because whenever you have games like this, I like having them here. And I'm checking the 5-day forecast. High at 89 in Miami on Thursday. Low, it'll be evening, closer to 81. So I don't think it's going to be too bad. There might be some thunderstorms in there worth keeping an eye on. By the way, I don't want to see Josh Allen necessarily just take over that game. I'd like them to be able to say this is a sequential team effort. They got some good, all those receivers. Shakir had a good game. Keon Coleman had a pretty good game. I want them to be able to do this as a team effort. They had a big game from Rousseau, etc. I think that's how you beat these teams, and that's how you win.
Yep.
It's not hero mode for Josh Allen. That's there when you need it, but let's not break that glass every week.
So besides this game on Thursday night, what's your circlet matchup for week 2?
See, we talked about Jordan Love earlier, and it looks like he's out for several weeks. They're being very coy. Like maybe he can come back from an MCL sprain
In
in
9 days.
in 9 days, with a international flight, and which is a thing you say when Malik Willis is your backed up quarterback.
Right.
Maybe that'll happen. Maybe Ryan Tannehill will paratroop into the field. So maybe someone will come and rescue us here. But I'm looking at that team against Anthony Richardson and the Colts, who are kind of a danger to themselves and others right now because it's going to be NFL blitz, touchdown, scrambling touchdown, interception, fumble. But that's kind of how the Colts look like they're going to roll for a while against this team that has to get Willis out there, get him ready. He's going to be doing a lot of zone read type stuff. He's got those weapons. And the Packers can't afford to go like 0-2, 0-3, 0-4, 1-5. Oh, and now Love is back. They've got to stay on schedule to a degree. And so this is, hate to say must win in week 2. This is a must find a way to win and demonstrate proof of concept that you can win in week 2. So I'm really looking at that Packers-Colts game. What about you?
And I will be buying stock in Josh Jacobs going into that game because I think that he's going to have a monster game on the ground.
Watch out for that other back. Who's that other kid? Isaiah?
It was Emmanuel Wilson.
Emmanuel Wilson, because he was, I think they're going to rotate them. I don't know Marshawn Lloyd's status. You're going to see a lot of Jacobs. You might see a lot of the other kid. You're going to see RPO, burp it in the flat to all the receivers. It's just a question of will that be enough? And also, the Packers defense didn't look phenomenal.
No, and I think that what we saw from Anthony Richardson scrambling around and making plays, the Alec Pierce touchdown where he basically saved himself by his forearm and then got up and threw a bomb into the end zone to Pierce. That's the roller coaster ride that's going to be the Indianapolis Colts. But if they can settle and if they can start to function within an offense and that defense makes some strides against Malik Willis, who if I'm Indy, I'm blitzing 78% of the time just to force him into mistakes.
Run blitz, yeah.
It could be a lot of fun, and it could be a team that could make some noise in a really fun division. But my circlet game is one that I'm really looking forward to, Mike. It is Tampa Bay and Detroit. Because I look at what happened. I want to know, is Baker Mayfield real or mirage? Not only Baker Mayfield from a year ago, but I watched that game against Washington on one of the 3 TVs I've set up here, and it was pinball wizardry quarterbacking down there with Evans and Godwin. They got McMillan involved. They ran the ball pretty well. I look at, we all saw what happened in Detroit. We saw the steamrollers in the backfield. We saw Aiden Hutchinson wreaking havoc. We saw the secondary with Kirby Joseph and those guys making plays. That to me is going to be a lot of fun. And it's a game that I had a couple of people in my preseason survey we talked about a couple of weeks ago suggest that Bucks Lions could be a potential NFC championship game. Now, I don't know that I subscribe to that theory, but I don't summarily dismiss it either with Todd Bowles' defense. And if Baker Mayfield is really the Baker Mayfield we've seen for the last 18 weeks or so.
I think Baker Mayfield is a real Raj. It's like he is perfectly capable of getting those balls to Evans and Godwin, and therefore you're a certain level of pretty good. And then, I don't know if you're going to take that next step, but that's what we might find out. This is a heat check. I don't think it's a heat check for the Lions because I think they're going to be fine no matter what. But if the Buccaneers get a win here, they're going into Detroit. And if they can get a win here and demonstrate that they can do what they did last week against a somewhat better defense, let's put it this way. You talk about not being able to name anybody. The only reason why we can name some of those guys on the Commanders defense is because they're 44 years old.
Right.
If you can do that, then you have to start taking the Buccaneers seriously as, yes, this is a playoff team. The team could win that division, and they certainly could. And then you can say, well, they can win a division. They won a playoff game last year. They won a Super Bowl a couple of years ago, different quarterback, but they keep doing this thing. Maybe this is the team that can move forward with some of the younger players with a new system that looks pretty good on offense. And with, again, that soft schedule where you're playing Coastal Carolina twice a year.
And for Detroit, it might not be a heat check game, but if they survive and they go 2-0, you go 2-0 beating Sean McVay, Matt Stafford, Kyron Williams, Cooper Kupp in that offense. You survive by beating what's become a high flying passing game in Tampa Bay with a pretty good defense. We'll see if Winfield Jr. is able to play at safety. It doesn't look like he's going to, but time will tell. But that defense is still pretty stacked. It's a team that went to the playoffs a year ago. Your 2-0 feels like a legitimate 2-0, and now you're just going to pedal down and go on that mission with the Fighting Dan Campbells. So to me, it's a very interesting and fascinating, test of wills between two pretty good playoff caliber teams.
It shouldn't be the fighting Dan Campbell's, but like the murdering, slaughtering, marauding
Dan Campbell.
Marauding Dan with apostrophe Dan Campbell's. But yeah, 2-0, two conference wins against, okay, let's call them wild card caliber opponents that can help you start building your playoff resume. That would be very strong.
Absolutely. Should be a lot of fun. Week 1 was a lot of fun as well. Week 2, I'm looking forward to it. He's Mike Tanier. Follow him on Threads at Mike Tanier. Subscribe to Mike Tanier's Two Deep Zone on Substack, and follow me on Threads at Matt Lombardo NFL. And be sure to subscribe to Between the Hash Marks on Substack and the Between the Hash Marks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all your favorite platforms. And leave us those 5-star reviews. We'll read them on the show next week. Mike, any parting shots?
No, you covered it all. Enjoy your week. I'm looking forward to Thursday night.
Should be a great week of games. We'll talk to you next week, same time, same place.